thank you very much for speaking to us here on All Angles. Now, firstly, there's been so many calls for government to drop fuel levies, but they still haven't. Although this time around, the finance minister during his budget speech did allude to that. What's taking them so long in making sure that they're able to help us as consumers and as business?
Well, I think from one side, we can understand that for the government, this is also a source of revenue. So it might not be as easy as it sounds just to take away all these levies that we're calling for from this side of the table. But given the situation that's playing out between Russia and Ukraine, I think now more than ever, the conversation then gets to be ventilated a bit more, just to cushion the consumers in particular of the impact that this may have, particularly on food prices. I mean, the cost of living has gone exponentially high in the last few years.
Now, we have a good relationship in terms of exports to these two countries, Ukraine and Russia. And, this war is also going to obviously contribute to us not being able to export and jobs being lost.
Yeah, definitely. So we do have a very good relationship with our exports and imports from the Ukraine and Russia. But when you just look at on the import side of things, we as South Africa import about 30% of our wheat from these particular countries. I think worth noting as well is that South Africa is a net importer of wheat. So the impact of the current situation playing out in Russia and Ukraine will have a dire impact on the staple foods. We'll probably see staple food prices going higher than seen in the last few years. And even just our export to those particular countries, in particular Russia, where we are the second largest producer and supplier of apples and pears, will need to probably seek alternative markets and open up new markets that we never traditionally exported to previously.
When you talk about wheat, I mean, that's quite problematic, Then I start thinking about bread, and, some of the foods that are used by the people who are in disadvantaged backgrounds, who rely on this food. And I read an article somewhere online which said that the price of bread would almost triple in the next 3 months or so.
And that's exactly it. I mean, from the one side, you have a supply crunch, particularly by these countries remaining at war, where they can then export. Just to set the context, between Russia and Ukraine, they produce about a quarter of the global wheat exports that we see. And this will definitely have a supply shock on global food prices. But over and above that, Russia is one of the leading exporters of oil in the world. And this will have a ripple effect onto fuel prices, which then we then see your retailers putting a markup in order for them to make up for the cost of delivering and buying of these particular foods from the farmers themselves. So at the end of the day, the poorest are the losers in the entire situation, as much as this will definitely be felt across the economy.
And this is also a concern for farmers because that means we have a backlog in terms of our exports and imports.
Yeah, definitely. And I think more than that as well, just undermines the viability of the sector itself going forward. I mean, farmers themselves are price takers. They don't necessarily pass on these rising costs onto the consumers themselves, but they tend to cushion and absorb this particular rising costs in this regard. So for the farmers themselves, this is a very big worry. From one side, it's the fuel side as well as the fertilizer prices that have almost doubled in most of the ingredients in the last year or so. So I think a big concern comes just on how this has a bearing on not just the producers themselves, but also on the consumers going forward. And will probably then be in for a very rough ride for the next couple of months.
Are you engaging at all with National Treasury or the presidency at the moment as Agri SA, trying to get them to hear you out about your plea in terms of at least fuel levies to start there? And if you are engaging with them, how the talks right now? Does it look positive?
Well, we're constantly in engagement with the relevant stakeholders, which you have also correctly noted is the National Treasury, where we try to find solutions that will probably insulate the sector, but also the consumers from such shocks themselves. As you rightfully pointed out earlier on, that in the budget speech, the minister himself did say, in as much as the levies are not increasing in this particular budget, there is probably room for us to consider either easing some of the admin fees, the levies that we see, or just taking some of them in that regard. So we're constantly in that engagement with the National Treasury as well as the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, just to see how best we can insulate again the consumers from this particular impact. And if you just set this on a global scale, when we then speak from an agricultural point of view, the sector receives little to no direct support from government compared to our international competitors. So this also has a bearing on our competitiveness as well as the viability of the sector going forward. And from that premise, from that standpoint, we then have these engagements with the relevant stakeholders.
All right, Agri SA Chief Economist Kulani Siweya, thank you very much for your time here on All Angles.